Chapter 19 Palace. The forest was still burning around us when my husbands called me to the makeshift canopy that had served as our home since we arrived in Khanda. I considered ignoring them. I was hot and irritable, and in the midst of putting together a meal with primitive, foraged foods. Our entourage, soldiers mostly, weren't much help. Besides, I was uneasy. I kept hearing the cries of animals, though I knew that couldn't be. There weren't any animals left in the wilderness of Khanda, not since Arjun set the forest on fire. The lucky ones had escaped, the rest were dead. Wind swirled ash along the ground. Smoke stung my eyes and coated my tongue. I looked for Krishna, then remembered that he had ridden off in search of something. My husbands were speaking with a man I hadn't seen before. Where had he come from? He squatted on the ground. Around him he had drawn lines with a stick. I couldn't tell what they were. I stared at him. He was short and stubby, dressed in skins. Rings of bone and gold pulled his earlobes down to the shoulders. He stared back, unblinking, as though I weren't the queen of this land, but an intruder. "Come, Panchali," Yudhishthir said. When I joined him on the wooden plank where he sat, he hesitated before putting an arm around my shoulder. The other brothers looked away, embarrassed. Were they thinking that next year, or the next, one of them would do the same to me? Better not ponder such things. Arjun leaned against his chariot, his face fire-flushed. "Respected lady," he said, "this is Maya." He kept his eyes on a distant column of smoke and used the formal mode of address. The anger he had felt at my wedding to his brothers still festered inside him, though he hid it so well that only I was aware of it. If I spoke to him, he answered politely in monosyllables. If I approached a place where he was, he found a reason to leave it. I wanted to shake some sense into him, but, along with exasperation, I felt sympathy. Sometimes, when he didn't know I was watching, there was a starkness on his face, the look of a man who was consumed by jealousy and hated himself for it. The ends of Arjun's long hair were singed. He was still carrying the giant bow that the god of fire had given him. It had a name, he had told us, Gandiva. From time to time, his hand caressed its curve as though it were a woman. I felt a sting, then chastised myself. I should be thankful he's consoling himself with a new weapon, I told myself, instead of looking for a new wife. He builds palaces for gods, Arjun continued, and for the Asura kings of the underworld. He's going to make us one too. Because Arjun saved him from the fire, Sahadev added proudly. A palace like no one has ever seen, Bhim said, throwing open his excited arms. I've asked him to build me a kitchen where 100 cook fires may be lit all at once, without need of fuel, Bhim loved to cook as much as he loved to eat. To my surprise, he had been the one to help me most these last few days, doing the heavy work, cleaning the animal carcasses, and roasting them over the open fire, while I boiled rice and cut up fruits. When I tried to lift a heavy pot from the fire, he took it from me, not caring if our hands touched. Our first day in Khanda, he had announced bluntly that Vyasa's laws, which were meant for palace living, were ridiculous now that we were stuck in the wilderness with only each other to depend on. He'd treat me as a man should treat his brother's wife, but he couldn't follow all those nitpicky rules. Whenever I needed assistance, he was going to provide it. If he figured out a way to make life in this hot, sweaty, insect-plagued jungle a little more bearable for me, he was certainly going to do it. And if Yudhishthir had a problem with that, he should banish him right now. My law-abiding husband hadn't been pleased, but ultimately he accepted what his brother said. I, on the other hand, had been most grateful at finding such a devoted champion. I silently sent Bhim my apologies for having dismissed him earlier as a boor, and at mealtimes I heaved his plate higher than the others. And stables with walls fashioned so cleverly that our animals will be warm in winter and cool in the summer, Nakul said. I had already seen on the journey how much he loved horses. He made us pause at regular intervals so that our mounts could be fed and watered. At night he walked among them, feeding them lumps of jaggery, making sure they were rubbed down. Even Yudhishthir's hell-raising charger nudged him gently with its massive head, whickering, and Nakul smiled as though he understood what it said. Once I overheard him declare that he trusted wild beasts more than any courtier he knew. Did the massacre at Khanda forest torment him? I would never know. Though they must have disagreed with each other from time to time, my husbands never revealed their dissension to outsiders. And in this matter, I was still an outsider. Kunti had trained them well. We need a great chamber of crystal and ivory where kings can discuss statesmanship or listen to music, Yudhishthir proclaimed. Or play at dice, Sahadev teased, because that was Yudhishthir's one weakness. We must have a dome that reaches up toward the sun to amaze all men and proclaim the glory of the Pandavas, Arjun said, looking into the distance, as though he could see things invisible to the rest of us. He clutched his bow as though he had never set it down. Bhim darted me a shy glance. Shouldn't we ask Panchali what she wants? And now I saw what, in my distraction, I had missed earlier. He loved me. I found the knowledge oddly painful. Yudhishthir nodded, reasonable as always, though by himself he wouldn't have thought to solicit my opinion. You're right, brother. Tell us, Panchali. But When I opened my mouth to speak, my mind turned blank. Ash blew onto my face, settled on my skin, gritty as ground up bone. I hadn't bathed for days. Why couldn't it have been Arjun who fell in love with me? He could have wrested my mind from the thoughts of a man who wouldn't stop occupying it, even though I'd never see him again. Later, when I asked why he had killed all those animals, Arjun would say, Agni wanted me to set the forest afire for him. I couldn't refuse a god, could I? But Krishna said, how else could you have settled here, built your kingdom, gained all that fame, changed the direction of history's wheel? Someone has to pay a price for that. You of all people should know this, Krishna. He was right. In order for a victory to occur, someone had to lose. For one person to gain his desire, many had to give up theirs. Wasn't my own life and my brother's proof of that? But I refused to agree to give Krishna that satisfaction. There was this too. I wanted to believe that sometimes good may happen without bad biting its heels. I wanted to believe that sometimes the gods give us gifts and ask for nothing back. He looked at me with a sigh, part sympathy, part exasperation. Dear one, he said, time will teach you what you refuse to learn from your well-wishers. They were waiting for an answer, so I said the first word that came as I stared at the dead landscape. Water. I want water. Everywhere. Fountains and pools. Ponds for birds to sport in. I didn't believe the ugly little man in front of me could make it happen, but he nodded, a considering spark in his eye. I want a stream wending its way through the palace, with lotuses blooming all year, I added. I was being outrageous, but why not? Everyone else was asking for impossibilities. Fires without fuel, towers that brushed the sun. But running water inside a home? Kunti would gasp when she saw it. Fool of a girl, didn't anyone teach you that it washes away good luck? I do it, Maya said. A gap gleamed between his crooked teeth as his lips pulled back in a grin. I give you more. Floors looking like rivers, waterfalls looking like walls, doorsteps all glittery like melted ice. Only wise people see through Maya's truth, but few so wise. All cry, how great are royal Pandavas to live in such palace. How great Maya, maker of palace. But first, you must give me right name for it. My husbands argued. Yudhishthir wanted to name the palace after their dead father, but the others didn't share his filial piety for a man they didn't remember. Arjun wanted to name it in honor of Shiva, god of the hunt, his favorite deity. Nakul suggested we should call it Indrapuri because wasn't it going to be a palace fit for the king, god? Sahadev feared that would be too prideful. What does Panchali think? Bhim asked. I looked at Maya. His flecked brown eyes glittered. Later, I'd wonder, was it malice I'd glimpsed in them? Along with gratitude, he must have harbored rage and sorrow, his home reduced to cinders around him, his companions dead or scattered forever. He inclined his head as though he knew what I was thinking and approved of it. But perhaps it was he who sent the words into my mind. If foreboding flew over me on scorched wings, crying for its dead mate, I didn't hear. I smiled with sudden elation, thinking, this is what I've been waiting for all my life. I said, this creation of yours that's going to be the envy of every king in Bharat, we'll call it the Palace of Illusions. Maya outdid himself as he built. He magnified everything my husband's wanted 100-fold, and over it all he laid a patina of magic, so things shifted strangely, making the palace new each day, even for us who lived there. There were corridors lighted only by the glow of gems, and assembly halls so filled with flowering trees that even after hours at council, one felt as though one had been relaxing in a garden. Almost every room had a pool with scented water. Not all his magic was benign, though. Early in our stay, before we got used to looking at things a certain way, we bumped into walls built of crystal, so clear that they were transparent, or tried vainly to open windows that were painted on. Several times we stepped into pools that were disguised as stretches of marble flooring and ruined our elaborate court attire. At those times I thought I heard Maya's disembodied, mocking laughter. But it all added to the allure of this palace that was truly like no other. On the day the palace was done, Maya took Arjun aside. You save Maya life, he said, so I give you warning. Live in palace, enjoy, but not invite anyone to come see. My husband pondered over the cryptic words. What did Maya mean? Was it a trick? Had he slipped a curse into the foundations as he built them? Asuras were not to be trusted. Everyone knew that. Still, they were reluctant to take him seriously. They had waited so long for a place they could call home, a setting that proclaimed their worth. How well I understood that craving. They yearned to show it off, to friends and enemies both. So did I, though only one man came to my mind. But Krishna said, Maya is right. Everyone who sees this palace will want it for himself. Envy is dangerous. You'll have to deal with it eventually. But why call it down on yourself before it's time? We didn't like what Krishna said, but we trusted his wisdom so reluctantly we cancelled the grand celebration we had planned. No doubt some people spoke ill of us, wondering at our inhospitality. This distressed Yudhishthir. Opinions were important to him. Still, those who loved us came to visit anyway, without an invitation even, and they returned home with such amazing stories that others followed. Many stayed on, for Yudhishthir was a just and kind ruler. Soon a prosperous city grew up around Khandav. People called it Indraprasth. That's how impressive it was. Minstrels began to make up songs about the unparalleled grandeur of the Pandava court. Slowly, the warnings we had been given by Maya, by Krishna, by Vyasa long ago, retreated into the lightless crevices of memory. These were good years for me. I loved my palace, and in return I felt its warmth embracing me, as though it were alive. Some of its serenity seeped into me, some wisdom, so that I learned to be happy with my lot in the world. And now that I had such a palace, how could I be otherwise? I took my place beside each of my husbands at the proper moment, and saw our pairings as movements in an elaborate dance. I saw my husbands too, differently. They were a unit together, 5 fingers that complemented each other to make up a powerful hand. A hand that would protect me if the need arose. A hand that had gifted me this beautiful palace. Wasn't that sufficient to be thankful for? My husbands, too, learned to appreciate my strengths. We were all surprised to discover that I had a good eye for matters of governance. More and more, Yudhishthir began to ask my advice when a tricky judgment had to be delivered, and I, having learned more of the workings of woman's power, was careful to offer my opinion only in private, deferring to him always in front of others. These were the years when I gave birth to my 5 sons, one from each husband. Prativindhya, Sutasoma, Srutakarman, Satanika, and Shrutasena. Their names were chosen by Yudhishthir, who favored hefty, polysyllabic appellations. Sometimes I was flustered by the children's clamoring. I'd get them confused. I loved the boys dearly, but I wasn't particularly maternal. Or perhaps my energies were used up in being a wife 5 times over, and a queen besides. Fortunately, Dhaima, whom I'd rescued from Kunti's tyrant grasp, was more than happy to take them off my hands. She chased after them day and night, regaling them with incentives, but, in truth, she was far more indulgent with them than she had ever been with me, a fact they took full advantage of. Dhri, who was busy helping my aging and increasingly cantankerous father rule his kingdom, visited me whenever he could. Here, for a while, he could set aside his cares as he hunted and rode and argued boisterously with my husbands about gaming strategies, or wrestled with my boys and showered them with too many gifts, or strolled with me in the gardens that were my delight. Once, when we were by ourselves, he praised me for the way I handled my unconventional domestic situation. "I didn't think you could have done it," he said. "You were so prickly about little things, always ready to rebel. Now you're truly a queen." I smiled. If I am, I owe it to my palace. When I repeated this to Krishna, he frowned. "Don't be so attached to what is, after all, no more than stone and metal and asura sleight of hand. All things in this world change and pass away. Some after many years, some overnight. Appreciate the palace of illusions by all means, but if you identify so deeply with it, you set yourself up for sorrow." Out of my fondness for him, I didn't argue, but inside I knew I had nothing to fear. Maya had promised us that no human would be able to harm our palace. No natural disaster lay it low. No one could wrest it from us. As long as we, or our descendants, lived in it, it was indestructible, and, in turn, it would protect us. It was as close to immortality as I could imagine, and enough to satisfy me. I dreaded bringing Kunti to my palace, and made excuses to delay it as long as possible. But finally she arrived, stepping from the carriage with an elaborate groan and disapproval stitched onto her prim, pursed lips. As my husbands guided her through the palace, I steeled myself for criticism. But the palace must have worked its magic on her, for after a few superficial complaints, she fell silent, and a childlike look of wonder came into her eyes. Once or twice I heard her laugh, in delight as Sahadev or Nakul. Strangely, they who were not born of her were her favorites, explained one of Maya's illusions to her. And, though she never complimented me on the planning of the palace, her pleasure in it melted some of the aversion that had encrusted my heart for so long. Kunti was a wise woman, wiser than me if truth be told. In those first days, her shrewd eyes examined much more than the curiosities in the palace. She saw that in this place I was mistress. Where my husbands had once relied on her, they now depended on me. She could not disrupt this state of affairs without causing her sons serious unhappiness. Perhaps the palace laid its calming finger on her, making her realize that she loved them more than she resented me. Had we remained in Hastinapur, in her husband's palace, I am sure she would have fought me fiercely for control. But the palace of illusions was my domain, and she accepted this, spending her days in the cool, fragrant garden, for here it was always cool, listening to the bulbuls sing. Or Was she a better actress than I gave her credit for, biding her time, waiting for the mistakes she knew I'd make?